Having finished chapter 24, we're now beginning our meditation on chapter 25 today. Now, although we've just turned the page, a full 2 years have passed between chapter 24 and chapter 25. Governor Felix was dismissed and recalled because he was implicated in various forms of corruption and also engaged in oppressive rule. And now Governor Festus arrives to take up the post as his successor. The new governor, Festus, setting off from Rome to reach the governor's headquarters in Caesarea was a very long journey, taken over 10 days by the transport at the time, which was by ship. He must have been exhausted upon his arrival. Yet, after just 3 days, he set out to inspect the Judean region, which was his area of responsibility. So the 3 days means the day he arrived was the first day, he rested for 1 day on the second, and then set out for the local inspection on the third day. This shows he was a man who didn't look after his own health, but strove to faithfully carry out the responsibilities he had been entrusted with. And the distance from Caesarea, where the governor's headquarters were located, to Jerusalem, the most important city in the Judean region, is over 100 kilometers. After resting for 1 day, pushing on for another 100 kilometers the next day was no easy task, but he went to Jerusalem to faithfully carry out his responsibilities. Upon arriving, he would have first met with the leaders of Jerusalem, wouldn't he? Who are they? They are the chief priests. When Governor Festus met with the chief priests to pay his respects, verse 2 shows that the chief priests and the prominent men among the Jews brought charges against Paul. Governor Felix, the previous Governor Felix, hadn't dealt with Paul properly and just left him there. And so 2 years have passed. From Paul's perspective, it's unfair. He thought he'd be released soon, but since he was kept in prison continuously, imagine how difficult those years must have been for him. However, when they heard a new governor was coming, he had some hope, but the problem was that as soon as the Jerusalem leaders met the new governor, they threw all manners and decorum out the window, and their very first words were just that. They started insisting that Paul, who was being held there, should be executed immediately. So, Governor Festus found himself in a situation where he had no choice but to put Paul on trial right there and then. Right, so if you look at verse 7, there's this account. The Jews who'd come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him. So they began listing Paul's alleged crimes and accusing him. But the problem is, just like in the previous trial before Governor Felix, there's no evidence. So they're just making claims without proof. Essentially, they keep accusing an innocent man. So Paul makes his defense against this. Right, verse 8. Paul made his defense, he argued, saying, I have committed no offense against the law, the temple, or Caesar, nor against the emperor. That is how he makes his defense. So, Governor Festus, having looked into it, couldn't find any fault in Paul whatsoever. You know, is that? He knows that Paul is innocent. Right, but Governor Festus has no intention of releasing Paul either. Why is that? He's just arrived as the new governor, his position's a bit precarious, and, well, he needs to win over the leaders in the Jewish region, doesn't he? So if you look at verse 9, there's this expression. Festus, wanting to gain favour with the Jews, asked Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Festus knows it clearly. Having held the trial, he knows there's no guilt, but he just can't let him go because of the Jewish leaders. So, what does he say? He asks Paul, shall I go up to Jerusalem with you? Why go up to Jerusalem? Because the Sanhedrin Council is there, you see. The leaders are there. He says, I'll mediate for you in front of them, so why don't you have a chat with them there? Just think about it, everyone. Nothing has changed in the situation from 2 years ago. He was put on trial 2 years ago, and even though it was clearly proven that he was innocent, the trial just fizzled out, and he's been stuck in prison ever since. When Paul heard the news that the governor was changing, he must have held on to a glimmer of hope. Surely when the new governor arrives, he'll set me free. But he went through the trial, was interrogated, and gave his own defence, yet it was exactly the same as it was 2 years ago. The result was a situation where absolutely nothing had changed. Now, when we find ourselves in a situation like this, what do we usually do? Is going to Rome really God's will? Could it be that it isn't? Shouldn't I be asking for God's will again? These are the kinds of thoughts we'd have, aren't they? Now, if you look at Acts chapter 19, verse 21, during his third missionary journey, Paul clearly receives a word from God. I must also see Rome. He clearly receives a word from God. And even if you look at chapter 23, verse 11, it says, you must also testify in Rome. God clearly gave him a word during his third missionary journey, you see. But the situation isn't progressing at all, and he remains imprisoned. So naturally, Paul must have been wondering, is this really God's will? Did I perhaps mishear it? I heard it twice, but could it still be wrong? So we usually end up asking God again and again, don't we? But today, Paul doesn't keep asking, where is God's will in all this? He doesn't ask that at all. So how does he resolve it? If you look at verses 11 and 12 of today's passage, he says, I appeal to Caesar. Festus conferred with his council and replied, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. Paul himself puts an end to this tedious, repetitive cycle of trials. To break free from it, he says, I will not be tried any longer. I must go to Rome. He decides that, having appealed to the emperor, he must get to Rome, even if it means going as a prisoner. And so he ends up going to the Rome he had always dreamed of. How could Paul be so absolutely certain that going to Rome was God's will? This is the point we need to reflect on today. If it were us, when things got this difficult, we'd be asking, where is God's will in all this? We'd be asking over and over again. We'd spend our time like that. But Paul decided he couldn't waste any more time, so how could he be so full of conviction as he headed to Rome? The difference between Paul and us. First, Paul had only one desire, one longing. Now, if you think Paul only had plans to go to Rome, that's not the case. If you look at Romans chapter 15, you'll see that Romans is actually a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome during his third missionary journey. Paul didn't just have plans for Rome during his third missionary journey. If you look at chapter 15, verse 23, he says this. He says that there's no longer any place for him to work in this region, no place left to work in this region during his third missionary journey, and that for many years he'd had it in mind to go to Spain. However, while he had the intention of going to Spain, he had a plan to visit you in Rome on the way before heading to Spain. So Paul had plenty of plans. Rome was in his plans, and Spain was in his plans too. But as we know full well, Paul later went to Rome and was executed there, wasn't he? He never made it to Spain. Now, if that's the case, wouldn't Paul have felt hard done by when he was executed in Rome? His original plan was to go to Spain, so why should he have to die here? God, this feels so unfair. He doesn't die feeling that hard done by. As we'll see later, he doesn't get hung up on his own ambitions. He doesn't push his own agenda. Why? Because they only had one true desire. It wasn't Spain and it wasn't Rome either. He had one single desire that he truly wanted. Actually, there is a rather popular Netflix series that is currently streaming, which is called All Your Wishes Granted. You all have expressions I've never seen before. It's really good. Do try to live piously, just like that. Let me explain it to you. If you look here, there's a genie who grants 3 wishes. But the reason it grants 3 wishes is to corrupt you. So hurry up and tell me your 3 wishes. Go on, tell me. I'll grant them all. That's right. And then it says that its name isn't actually Genie, but Satan, because it corrupts people, making them state 3 wishes and then corrupting humanity. How is that possible? When we're told to make 3 wishes, people's desires get stimulated like this, so they become obsessed with greed. Appetites, the need for security, the lust for power, the desire for fame, all sorts of desires start to bubble up, right from the very bottom. So you end up wanting to do this and choose that. There's just too much to do. The point is, if you get obsessed because of that greed, you'll eventually become corrupted and end up ruined. Actually, we're all quite familiar with fairy tales like this, aren't we? You know that story where some goblin or something appears to an old man and woman and says they'll grant them 3 wishes, right? At that point, their ears prick up at the mention of 3 wishes, and as they're thinking about what to ask for, the old man has this thought. He said he wanted a rice cake, and lo and behold, a rice cake just appeared right there. Seeing that, the old woman got angry and shouted, "You old fool, wasting such a precious wish on just one thing. I hope that rice cake gets stuck to your nose, you old codger." And just like that, it stuck right onto his nose. They'd already used up 2 of their wishes. They'd wasted 2 wishes just by arguing. They were agonising over whether or not to use the 3rd and final wish to get it off, but they couldn't exactly let the old codger walk around with it stuck to his nose for the rest of his life, could they? So they used the 3rd wish to make the rice cake fall off. So you're familiar with that fairy tale, aren't you? The one that depicts the greedy nature of humans who end up achieving absolutely nothing. That's what humans are like. Once our desires start getting stirred up, especially when you're given 3 wishes, you just don't know what to choose, because we're just too greedy. You know, when you study psychology, they talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, don't they? Maslow talks about the first level, the physiological needs, doesn't he? Things like eating, drinking, sleeping, and so on. Once these first level needs are met, you then move on to the second level, which is what we call safety needs. There's that desire to feel psychologically and physically safe. And once that need is met, they say the 3rd level is the need for love and belonging. It's about wanting to love and be loved, wanting to make friends, wanting to have a family, that sort of thing, innit? And then they say you move on to the 4th level after that, the need for esteem. It means we have this desire to be recognised, to be respected, that sort of thing. Up to this 4th stage, these are deficiency needs, and once these are all met, you move on to the final 5th stage, the need for self-actualization, where you unleash your potential and pursue some form of creative growth, or so the theory goes. Right, but honestly, how many people do you think actually achieve self-actualization like that in their lives? We don't just naturally move from having our physiological needs met to the next stage of safety needs and then on to the need for belonging. That's not how it works. Even if we've moved up, if I find I'm lacking in my physiological needs, I want to fill those up again. We just want to keep filling them up over and over again, endlessly. It's not like, oh, I've filled this, now on to the next stage, filled that, now on to the next. That's why we've never seen a life that's truly self-actualized. Why is that? It's because we are inherently sinful beings who, once our desires are stirred, become obsessed with greed and end up ruining our own lives. That's why when Satan came to tempt Jesus, he offered 3 temptations, didn't he? Satan knew full well that Jesus would be hungry after fasting for 40 days. So what was the first thing he said to him? If you are truly the Son of God, turn these stones into loaves of bread and eat. I know you have physiological needs right now, so satisfy them quickly. He provokes him by saying, go on, satisfy that desire. Of course, Jesus also had a need to satisfy his physiological hunger, as he was starving. But Jesus speaks. What does he say? Well, while physiological needs are important, the one thing on my mind is living by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That is what he says. The second temptation is when Satan tries to provoke the need for safety, isn't it? He takes him up to a high place and says, try jumping off. Doesn't the Psalms say that angels will lift you up and keep you safe? Have faith and jump, he tempts him. It sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? But what does Jesus say? No, do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's not the case that you must have your safety guaranteed before you can serve God and do his work. What matters is looking to God, believing in him and following him. That is what he says. What is the third temptation? He shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, saying, if you bow down to me, I will give you all this glory. It stimulates the fourth stage, the need for esteem. It provokes the desire to be recognized and respected by others, doesn't it? He tempted Jesus using that very desire. But Jesus replied, no, God alone is the one to be worshipped. Jesus was focused solely on God and longed only for him. It's not that physiological needs like eating, drinking and sleeping aren't necessary. They are necessary. The need for safety is obviously necessary too. We need to ensure our physical and mental safety to get by in this world, don't we? The need for respect is obviously necessary too. A person needs self-esteem to be able to live, after all. We need to be recognized to live. Such desires are naturally necessary. However, if you keep obsessing over fulfilling these desires, you end up living a life fixated on greed, and you become trapped in a thirst that can never be quenched, no matter how much you fill it, which ultimately ruins your life. It means you end up becoming corrupt. So it means that only when a single soul longing sorts out and puts all those greeds in order can we truly find God's will. So in reality, when Jesus called his disciples, well, the disciples actually came to find Jesus first, didn't they? They're also disciples who come to find him, aren't they? In John chapter 1, verse 38, Jesus says something to the people who come to find him and want to follow him. Jesus turned around, looked back, saw those following him and asked, what are you looking for? What is it that you are seeking that makes you want to follow me? You looking to become my disciple? What are you seeking? That is what he says. However, the expression, what are you seeking here, is in the singular. He does not ask, what things are you seeking? One thing. What is it? That is how he asks. What is that one thing? Naturally, to follow as a disciple of Jesus, loving God, following God, that one longing is what's important. As we go through life, there are times when physiological needs are strongly manifested, other times when the need for safety becomes a strong priority, and still other times when the need for affection is particularly strong. These things will keep cropping up from time to time. But above all else, when you have a longing for God, it doesn't mean those needs aren't necessary, but you can put them in order. It means you can sort them out without becoming obsessed with them. Then, what God's will is for us begins to become clearly visible. I've mentioned this before, but we usually think, right, which company should I go to? Where is God's will? We agonize over it, don't we? We pray about it, don't we? Let's say one place offers a salary of 40 million won and another place offers 50 million won. Well, the place that pays 50 million won, you'd practically have to live at that company. I mean, there's loads of overtime too. But the place offering 40 million says they'll let you have a bit more freedom with your own time. We pray because we don't know which place is God's will. There are people who come to me like that, but you're all pretending you don't, which is a bit embarrassing for me, but it's true, innit? Everyone, you think, where should I go? Which one is God's will? We agonize and pray over that, don't we? Why is that? Why do we agonize and wonder where God's will lies? Why can't we decide? And why do we keep praying, asking, and even coming to me to ask about it? It's because you're not happy with either of them. Why are you pretending otherwise? You're not happy with either of them. If you were happy with one, you'd have decided already, but you're feeling a bit disappointed. What is it that we actually want? Wouldn't it be great if they offered 50 million won and gave you a bit more flexibility with your time? You wouldn't have to think twice and you'd just go for it. But since that's not the case, that greed starts to creep in. And because of that greed, you start asking, where is God's will? You keep clashing with it. Paul must have certainly had those kinds of needs that Maslow talks about. Paul was human too, so why wouldn't he have had those same desires and needs? However, Paul had one singular longing, a powerful desire to love and follow God, which is why he was able to sort out all those other needs. That is why God's will was clearly visible to him. And that is why he was able to walk that path firmly to the very end. Now, the second difference between Paul and us is that he didn't shirk responsibility. Marriage is a hugely significant event in our lives, isn't it? When facing a major life event like marriage, what is the most common thing people who don't believe in Jesus do? They often go to have their fortunes told. But I can tell you categorically that it's not just non-believers who get their fortunes told before marriage. I've seen Christians doing it too. I've seen so many people like that. Oh, that's for certain. But why do they do that? We consider it superstition. So why, with a wedding on the horizon, do they feel the need to seek it out and get their fortunes told? Marriage is such a massive deal, isn't it? Especially when it's your child's wedding coming up. There's so much to worry about, isn't there? Because of that, they're looking to offload some of the responsibility for this decision. They want to shirk the responsibility. They want to unburden themselves a bit. So there's a strong desire for someone to validate this marriage and give it their seal of approval. Because it's such a heavy matter, the more important the issue, the more they feel the need to keep asking for reassurance. This same psychology is actually at work when we ask about God's plan. We call it God's plan, asking, God, please show me. But really, we just want to lighten our own load. The urge to shirk responsibility starts to creep in. Now look at Paul. The situation hasn't changed at all. In that case, Paul himself must be finding it tough, surely. You'd think he'd ask for God's will, but he makes the decision without even seeking it. Now, what decision does he make? He appeals to the emperor. He just decides outright that he's going to get to Rome, even if he has to do it that way. Now, we'll take a closer look in the next chapter, chapter 26, but in chapter 26, there's another account of Paul defending himself once again before King Agrippa. But after hearing Paul's defense, King Agrippa and the newly appointed Governor Festus have a conversation about it. Chapter 26, verse 32. Agrippa said to Festus, if this man, Paul, hadn't appealed to Caesar, he could have been released. He knew it, you see. He knew the fact that Paul was innocent. He could have even released him, but because Paul had appealed to the emperor, they were now forced into a situation where he had to be transported as a prisoner until the emperor's trial. Now, if that's the case, did God say to Paul, hey, why did you go and appeal on your own accord? You should have waited a bit. You should have asked for my will. Why didn't you ask for my will and instead decided on your own, making things so difficult? Did God say that to Paul? No, that's not the case. God's will, God's plan, isn't an off-the-shelf product. It's not a finished product. It's not a ready-made product. It's something we discover. So, the process of discovering it can naturally be prayer. That process of discovery can be navigated through prayer. However, it's not just through prayer that we find it. It's also by using the reason and will that God has given us in our lives to make decisions and discover God's will. That too is part of the process of finding God's will. That's why Paul says this in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. Does it say to pray for what God's will is? No, it says to discern it. This term, dokimazo, means to test, to refine, to verify. You all know well what it means to verify something, don't you? It means proving for yourself that God's will is right by putting it into practice. That is what verification is. It's not about just waiting around doing nothing while only pursuing God's will, but about making decisions and taking responsibility. That is the process of discovering God's will. That is how you can discover it. Everyone. If one job offers a salary of 50 million won, but requires you to work at the office all day, and another offers 40 million won, but gives you more freedom with your time, which one should you choose? Coming to ask a pastor and praying again before God. God, please teach me. Please let me know your will. Praying like that over and over is not the right attitude of faith. People might see that as a truly obedient faith, but in reality, it's actually a sign of decision paralysis. You really ought to be thinking about things like that, you know. Like, I'm having a lot of trouble with my family relationships lately. I need to spend some time with my family, with my children. Or, I need to focus on self-improvement for me future. You need to use that kind of thinking, rational thinking, to make a decision in this situation. Now, as we shall see a little later on when we get to chapter 27, Paul is eventually transported all the way to Rome, where he arrives as a prisoner. He's being taken to Rome by ship under the guard and surveillance of several soldiers, but then, because of a massive gale called the Euroclydon, the ship ends up on the brink of being wrecked. So when even the experienced sailors on the ship were trembling, thinking we're all done for now, God speaks to Paul. In chapter 27, verse 22, it says, "Keep up your courage. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." God clearly reveals his will and his word, saying that none of you will die because of this storm. So Paul tells them that to the people around him. However, as the storm continued, it didn't stop, it just kept going. The sailors became fearful and worried, thinking, this won't do, and they lowered the lifeboats to save themselves. They lowered the lifeboats and intended to escape in them alone. Paul sees what they're doing. As soon as Paul sees it, he says, "Stop them." That's what he says. In verse 31, Paul says to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men, these sailors, stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. Your lives can't be guaranteed." He tells them to stop them. Does that make any sense to you? Just think about it. God had clearly promised that in this storm, no one would lose their life. God had given a firm assurance that not a single person would die, hadn't he? If that's the case, why would Paul care whether the sailors left or stayed, whether they lowered the lifeboats or not, or even if they went snorkeling? They were all going to survive anyway. So why did he insist that unless those men were stopped, their lives could not be guaranteed? And why did he take such decisive action? It is simply God's will. Paul knew the fact that his will was being fulfilled in that way. God takes pleasure in our decisions and our responsible actions, and by taking pleasure in them, he brings his will to complete fulfillment. That is God's providence. No, just because God is said to decide everything, it doesn't mean that doing nothing, thinking nothing, and just following along with your brain switched off is the kind of faithful life that God delights in. I know many of you are already aware of this, but I'm mentioning it again because it's a helpful point. Before I came to Singapore, I was serving as a senior pastor in Seoul. When I arrived at that church, they had just constructed a new 6-story building. However, because they'd built this new facility, they were left with a significant amount of debt. However, even with all that debt, we were blessed, and within a year the congregation had doubled in size, and people started gathering, which was just incredible. We were very grateful. But because of a heavy debt, when we were drawing up the budget, the allocation for Sunday school and the next generation was absolutely zero. They hadn't set aside any budget for it at all. So I felt that carrying on like this wasn't right, and I suggested that even though we had a lot of debt, since our numbers had grown, we should have faith and set a budget for it. But then there was opposition. They insisted that we had to pay off all the debt first, and that's what caused all the fuss. It all kicked off because of that. So I really had to wonder, should I continue my ministry here? I mean, if the people in the apartment complex see the church fighting, it gives us a bad reputation. So I questioned whether I should be carrying on with my ministry like this. I was really torn about whether I should stay or leave. Where does God's will lie in all this? It's not an easy decision to make. So what I came up with was, well, I couldn't just put it to a vote on whether to approve the budget or not. Since you all need to trust and follow me, I suggested we hold a vote of confidence so you can do just that. So I proposed a vote of confidence. And the condition is this. If it's unanimous, I'll stay. But if it's not unanimous, I'll leave. So I'd like you all to think carefully and cast your votes. By doing this, I thought to myself that I would be asking for God's will through that outcome. And then I called for a vote. Well, there wasn't a single dissenting vote. And while there were votes in favour, there was one abstention. Right, so everyone, if it were you, would you consider this unanimous? Or would you say it's not unanimous? That was the dilemma I was facing. I'm going to ask for God's will again. But then, where does God's will lie? I fell into that dilemma once more. In the end, well, since I'm here, I'm obviously still preaching in this spot. That's how it turned out. Even now, I do occasionally meet people from that church from time to time. Back then, when I first arrived here, I received a lot of messages and met up with people quite a bit. What do you think they said to me back then? Pastor, that's really too much. We feel resentful. Even now, when I look back, there are still people who say things like, we really felt resentful back then. So when I heard that from them back then, and I still hear it occasionally now, what do you think I said to them? It was God's will. Well, I am sorry. It is my fault. I am truly sorry. I still feel that way now. Why? It is my responsibility. It is my responsibility. So, am I confessing that by ministering in Singapore right now, I am doing something that is not God's will? No. I am grateful that it is God's will. God, thank you for fulfilling your will in my life. I am ministering with gratitude. God is with us in our decisions. Do not be afraid, everyone. Do not try to avoid responsibility. Make your decisions prayerfully. Sometimes that might be a mistake. There are times when I make the wrong decision too. But do not worry, everyone. Romans 8:28, which we know so well, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. God brings it to pass, because that plan was God's plan all along. That purpose was God's purpose all along. It was not my purpose. It was God's plan and God's purpose all along. If we take a step today without shirking our responsibilities, with a heart that loves God and longs only for him, God will bring about his purpose through that very step. And I trust you will believe that you will see with your own eyes that God's purpose has been fulfilled.